Hello, my quilting friends. My name is Leah Day, and welcome to this Frame Quilting Friday. Now, I've got a bit of a weird project here today. This is a red baby quilt that I basted and started quilting on my home machine, but I realized it was just going to take me too much time to finish on the home machine, so now I want to move it to my long arm. So I want to show you this process of getting the quilt onto the frame, because you can do this. You can start a quilt on your home machine, you can move it to the long arm, you can take a quilt off a long arm partially finished and finish it up on your home machine. So the very first thing that I've done here is pin the quilt to the leaders. And this was a little bit weird because it is a very thick minke back. Normally what I would do is I would rip the edges of the quilt to make sure that they were nice and straight to pin to the leader cloth. Well, I can't rip minke, and I've stabilized it here with a French fuse too. That's really tricky, and I could tell that this edge at least was definitely not cut straight. This edge did look like it was cut straight, so I started there and pinned that on, and I have another video on installing a quilt, on loading a quilt into a frame, so definitely watch that for tips on pinning. So that's where that is looking good right there. I'm going to go ahead and lock that lock on the side so that way it's ready to roll up. But as you can see, I have all of these basting pins in place, and that's not going to go very well whenever I start to advance the quilt and roll it up on that bar. Over here, what I decided to do was fold the edge of the minke over just a bit. You can kind of see that here. That helped me get a nice straight edge, but again, it's not 100% perfect. So as I roll this quilt up, I'm just going to have to keep that in mind. It might be ever so slightly wonky on the frame. I don't think it's a deal breaker. But what I want to do, what I've decided to do, is basically just baste across. So this is actually, as I'm tightening up, you can actually see here what I'm talking about as far as it not going on the frame quite right. See how this over here is saggy and this over here is tight? Let me adjust my camera, you can see it better. So you can see what's going on with the quilt a little bit more clearly. Over here, the quilt is running a little tight. It's holding up a little bit nicer, but it's sagging down on this end. What might have happened is there might be more pins in the quilt over here that's causing this roll to be bigger, which is putting more tension on the quilt, and that could be lifting it up. The whole quilt could be out of square and that edge be slightly longer, which means that it's kind of being pinned at a weird angle. You can try tightening it up just a little bit more and that improves it. But this is a guess. I've never done this before, certainly not with a big fluffy minke back. And I'm experimenting here, so just bear with me. My idea for fixing this is to do a baste stitch and basically run some lines of stitching across this to stabilize it, to be able to take pins out and be able to work basically from this edge, which I know is straight and square, and to work that way. So this is an experiment. Let's see if it's going to work. What I'm going to do is drop my needle down and bring it back up again. And then I'm going to change my stitch setting to a baste stitch. So let's see here. I'll go into my menu and go down to the baste stitch. And let's see how this works. So I don't use the baste stitch often, and a lot of people ask me questions about that, and it's because, yeah, I find it just a little bit weird. It's not working, basically. My preference, honestly, let me go back into my menu, and I'm going to go back to regulated cruise. Actually, I'm going to go back to regulated precise, and then I'm just going to adjust my stitch length down to 8 stitches per inch, which is half the size that I normally do. So the baste function, I just find it, actually I'm going to go down to 6 stitches per inch. I just find the baste function, I don't know, maybe I just haven't understood how to use it yet. That's a very good possibility, honestly, but I just don't like it as much as I like just using the regular regulated cruise, regulated precise stitch function, and then just lowering that stitch length down to something like 8 or 6 stitches per inch, because I am going to take these basting stitches out. This is not going to stay in the quilt permanently. As you can see, I am getting a lot of shifting, and now I'm wondering if this is going to work. Let's keep running with it and see what happens. From here, I can see I need to take some pins out, but what I might want to do is advance the quilt to this area that is already quilted and work from there, because quite frankly, I'm looking at this and I'm getting a lot of movement, and I think that it's going to end up messing up the quilt. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick that out. You know, like I said, this is an experiment, and I want to see what works and learn along with you guys. So that idea of starting right here, basically, I'm going to pull the machine back so that way you can really see what I'm talking about. The idea of starting down here, which was basically in the pin section, is a little bit wobbly bobbly. I don't think this worked well because I'm getting ripples, the quilt is moving, and while it doesn't have to be absolutely perfect, I still want a little bit better stitches than this. And because I had my setting set at 6 stitches per inch, as you can see, this comes out real easy. So there's an advantage of lowering that stitch length down. So it's going to come out real quick, real easy. And quilting is a learning process, experimenting, trying new things. You might have a quilt and be like, I wonder if I can get this on my long arm. It might have been basted in your closet for years. And that, you know, this is a question mark. This particular quilt has been basted for several months. I got started with quilting it, did some ruler foot quilting on it, was experimenting with my rulers back when I was first designing them with Grace Company, and then, you know, life got in the way, things got busy, and I didn't really have a plan for finishing this quilt, so it just kind of got folded up and stashed in a corner. That happens to a lot of my quilts, by the way. So I knew I wanted to get it quilted, you know, and because it's minke on the back, it does take up quite a bit of space. So this is a good opportunity to not just finish a cute quilt, but it's also an opportunity to learn something new and build new skills for using the long arm in creative ways. Okay, so I'm getting into this kind of puddly area here. I'm going to just keep on clipping. What I'm doing is I'm just clipping the bobbin thread, which allows me to pull on the top thread, pulls out several stitches at once, very speedy. Whenever you're pulling out basting stitches, it's very fast. And I probably will lower that stitch length even more for the next run, just in case I have to pull them out again. So there we go. All of those basting stitches are removed. Now I'm going to pull the long arm into the quilt, and I'm going to see where I'm hitting. I've got this quilted section down here. That's the most stable part of the quilt. So if I could run through that area and start the basting there, maybe start it in the center and work my way out. That's, you know, really coming from home machine, that's how we do it. We start in the center, we work our way outward, and that really gets everything nice and stable. So I'm going to look around and go on ahead and take out as many pins and pin mores as I can, because I might just go straight backwards and over a bit and just work that way. So here we go. I'm going to adjust my stitch length again. I'm going to take it down to 4 stitches per inch. That's the lowest setting I can do on this machine. And I am using 2 colors of thread here. Not my typical thing. Basically, I am trying to use up old bobbins. And I know I usually advise people not to do that. Don't use mystery bobbin thread. It's usually a disaster, but I know exactly. This is isocord thread in the top. It's isocord thread in the bobbin. So I know what it is. It is going to balance with itself pretty nicely. But I'm just trying to empty that bobbin, and it is all the way full of bright orange thread. Okay, so I'm taking out some pins. And this basting may end up taking a while. You know, this is one of those things where kind of resurrecting a quilt, you know, taking it from home to long arm may take a little bit of time to get everything situated, to get it all working nicely. But I think in the end, it's going to end up taking far less time than if I continue to try and do a complicated ruler foot quilting design on my home machine. I mean, it's still very fast. I gotta say, ruler foot quilting is generally a very fast technique. But on the home machine, even a quilt this small, pushing it through the arm of the machine was still very slow. And I just didn't have time to be working on it on top of everything else. So that's why I decided, let's turn this into a video. Let's make it an adventure. And it's definitely turning into that. Okay, so here I have stitched now all the way off to the right. And I'm aiming about 2-inch wide lines of quilting here. And this is at 4 stitches per inch. And as you can see, I'm doing a lot of manipulating of the quilt. It's pulling just a bit. It's being a little It's moving quite a bit more than my quilts usually do on the long arm, but I think that's still going to be okay. Could be the minke on the back being a little weird. I've not used this rose style minke on a quilt on the long arm yet, so I think there's any number of variables here that could be coming into play. But so far, this is looking a lot better. I'm really glad I'm working from the center, and my motion here, I came up and down. It's like an L shape, over and up. And this is, honestly, this is what I do on a home machine. I call it quadrant quilting. You break the quilt up into 4 sections, and those 4 quadrants, you quilt each quadrant, and it stabilizes the quilt. Everything kind of pushes out towards that open corner, and it works really well. Maybe because I started this quilt on a home machine, that's the way I need to baste it. It's hard to say. Getting a little bit of movement here. You can see that square went just a little bit wonky. What I'll try and do is kind of mush on it a little bit. Fabric is wonderfully bouncy and springy, and as I go back over it with more quilting, maybe I can pick out some of the basting stitches and straighten things up just a bit. We'll see. So I'm quilting back this way, and I'm going to tug on the minke over here and then flatten it out as I go straight back. Looking good. I'm pretty satisfied with that so far. It'll be remain to be seen if this droopy corner over on the other side works the same. That'll be the big question mark. And we're almost done with this side, so we'll be able to see. So here you can see just getting a little bit of wobble. You can see that 9 patch is tilting ever so slightly that direction. Yes, I'm probably being a lot more persnickety about this. You know, if the point is just to get it done, then, you know, it doesn't have to be absolutely perfect, obviously, but I'm still investigating this as far as looking at the upsides and downsides of moving a quilt from a home machine to a long arm. I'm trying to sneak up on top of that fabric right there, and it's not wanting to sneak up. There we go. I got on top of it. You know, so the upsides and downsides of moving a quilt after you've started quilting it, after it's got pins in it, after you've started that process. I'd say a much easier move is to start on a long arm and maybe baste on the long arm, move it to a home machine. And then if you have to, because you prepped up the backing fabric with nice straight sides, nice ripped edges, you can always then go back to a long arm pretty quickly too. That's not a challenging thing to do, because I think the major reason why I'm struggling here is probably the minke backing, which was not square and straight. And I think that is 90% of the problem here. Okay, so I'm just kind of slightly rolling this side up, and I'm slightly tweaking the quilt and maybe getting it a little bit more tightened as I start this wonky area. So let's go. So here we go. Again, it's a spacing of about 2 inches apart, and I'm kind of being guided by the squares on the quilt, which are giving me a good visual reference for that. Okay, so now coming over. And it is definitely really wobbly. The whole side of the quilt on this side is really sagging downward. But I think as I stitch over, maybe it will work. In the end, even if this quilt ends up being slightly distorted through one side, I don't want you to feel like I'm ruining my quilt. I'm still getting the layers stabilized. I'm still locking them together. You know, this basting stitch is still doing its job and locking those layers in place. What I may end up with as I quilt over this area with rulers and my design, I may end up with a pleat or 2. And that's about it. I don't think that this is going to cause any kind of issue for the finished quilt. You know, I don't think that the minke, I'm feeling it as I stitch over it. I don't think the minke's doing anything weird on the back either. So this isn't damaging the quilt in any way, so don't worry about that. Okay, so now coming over. I'm actually pretty surprised. I expected to maybe get some skip stitches or something because the fabric is just so loose in this area, and it's not. I'm not getting any skip stitches. I'm just smoothing it out with my hand, kind of running right above the foot, and that's working pretty good. The biggest thing is just stopping and getting all the pins out and opening up the area completely so that way I can have the whole space open. You don't want to leave the pins in there and accidentally hit them with your foot. That's no fun. There we go. Click it back on. And this might be a situation where I want to pull out these clamps. So these are basically clips on the far ends of the long arm, and I very rarely use these because I always have my ruler plate on my machine, and the ruler plate will kind of bump up against them unless I use nice wide backing fabric. Well, the backing fabric is actually quite wide on this quilt, so I think I can get away with using this. And what that's doing is it's just pulling on that edge and nicely lifting it. So I think that's going to help make the difference here. I'll be honest, I think I'm just a little lazy and the clips just take 1 extra minute longer. And that's it. That's why I don't usually use them. My backing fabric, while I try and make sure that I have about 1 inch or 2 of extra space, really you want a good extra 4 inches to have those clips on the sides and not be bumping up against them whenever you have a ruler plate on your machine. Here we go, 1 last little bit, and I am tickled to death. This is excellent. This has really worked out well, and yeah, I feel like that's stable. I feel like it's locked in place. I have a few areas that might be a bit puddly, but I think overall that's really good. So that's it for this video. This was quite an adventure, taking a quilt that I started on a home machine that I had basted for home machine quilting and putting it on the long arm. It's tricky. That's a transition that I would say is much harder than going from a frame to your home machine. You could rent time at a local quilt shop that has a long arm for rental, and you could rent time there and do your basting on the frame, which is a lot faster. It's a lot easier on your body. It is my favorite way to baste a quilt, to be completely honest. And then you could take that quilt off the frame, go put it on your home machine and do the quilting. You could also then take it off your home machine and go put it back on the frame easily because the edges of the backing are cut nice and straight, theoretically, and are easy to pin back in place. I would say the mistake here that I made from the very beginning was not trimming up my backing fabric. I should have taken this, spread it out on my big table, and trimmed the edges nice and square to the edges of the quilt. Basically put a ruler on the edge of the quilt and said, okay, that's my straight line, and then cut the backing fabric, this minke, to fit that. That's what I should have done. I was feeling a little lazy. I was in a little bit of a hurry, so I rushed that. And what ended up happening is the backing wasn't straight. So it went on the frame slightly skewed, so it was slightly tilted that way. Then as I advanced the quilt, I had puddle in the upper left corner. When I came down here, I had puddle in the lower right corner. That's telling me it's skewed that way. Was it a deal breaker? No. Have I ruined my quilt? No. I might put a few pleats in the quilt as I quilt over it, but that's not the end of the world either. I'm really happy it's here, it's on the frame. Now I have something I can quilt, and we're gonna learn some more ruler foot quilting next week. So that's it for this video and experiment. I hope you learned a lot. I certainly did. If you'd like to find more Frame Quilting Friday videos, come and check them out at leahday.com/frame. You can also learn more about the Grace Qnique 14 Plus or 15R, the long arm machine that I am using, and the Continuum quilting frame. So come and check that out at leahday.com/frame. And until next time, let's go quilt.